Welcome to the 49th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate consulting firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host the New Ventures podcast to help people starting climate initiatives learn from others who are already progressed in these paths. My faithful audience would remember that I'm doing a series on early stage climate innovation in the United Kingdom. We already had Chris Coleridge of Carbon 13, Nick Light of the Green Angel Syndicate, and Naveed Chaudhary of the Greenhouse. Today we have a very special organization, Deep Science Ventures. It is a venture creator which uses a mapping of scientific knowledge and market trends to define a set of opportunities. Their focus is on computation, pharma, but also, most importantly for this podcast, agriculture and climate. We are obviously going to take a deep dive into their climate work. And to do that, we have Adam Tomassi-Russell, who leads the climate and energy portfolio, and Dr. Pina Fritz, head of scoping of the climate portfolio. Welcome, Adam and Pina.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, Sanjoy.
Thanks for having us.
Adam and Pina, the unique thing about your approach is that it seems to be proactive. From the broad climate scope, how do you narrow down to specific things that you want to look at?
Yes, thank you for this question, because this is obviously a very important part within our work and within what we do at DSV. So just from an abstract perspective, our scoping approach to assessing venture creation opportunities always starts with defining a target outcome that we want to contribute to. Then when we have defined this target outcome, we break it down into sub-outcomes. Along the way, we are identifying requirements, constraints, potential solutions, and eventually we arrive at an outcome that can be solved by a specific set of technologies that can be turned into a venture. So this is basically the very abstract explanation of how we do scoping and how we identify opportunities for venture creation. But I can also give you a bit of a more specific example as to how we narrow down these outcomes. Ultimately, everything that we're working on in the climate team should contribute to a reversal of global heating. So this is basically our target outcome within the climate team, the reversal of global heating. And I think by now we're all familiar with the options we have to achieve this at a high level: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, drawing down historic emissions, or changing radiative forcing. For example, when zooming into reducing CO2 emissions and decarbonizing our power supply, which is around 20% of today's CO2 emissions, an obvious outcome to target is to increase renewable electricity supply. That's obviously a no-brainer. And by now, solar and wind have surged. From 2019 to 2021, solar grew by 47%, wind grew by 31%. And today, the share of zero carbon power in electricity generation is at 36%, which is, of course, an incredible achievement so far. But if we want to achieve the agreements or the targets that have been set in the context of the Paris Agreement, zero power needs to reach 74 to 92% by 2030 and even up to 100% by 2050. The Systems Change Lab has a beautiful interface to get a quick overview about these numbers. And yet still the question is, how do we manage to close this gap? How do we really get to these deployment goals that we have set ourselves? And this is exactly what we're diving into now. So what are the potential constraints that will delay or that are risking to delay the deployment goals for renewable energy? And here, what we are focusing on, or one important part, is to sustain a robust supply chain for raw materials as an essential part in the deployment of renewable electricity amongst all the end applications. So this is why we're not necessarily focusing on making PVs or wind turbines better, but rather how we can avoid supply chain constraints in the context of critical materials. So this is basically the outcome that we have set for ourselves in this context. And this is how we think we can best support the outcome to decarbonize renewable electricity supply and in the end, reverse global heating. And then in the end, within our methodology, we would basically drill further down into the problems associated with closing the supply constraints of critical minerals. This is requiring us to better understand how the demand for these individual elements will increase and what the constraints are on the supply side. So in principle, it is all about understanding or forecasting the biggest constraints to achieving a net zero goal and then proposing the best solutions to solving them, and then assessing the opportunities that we identify against neglect, tractability, and upside. So at the moment, next to the focus on avoiding supply chain constraints on critical minerals, we're also looking at scaling the infrastructure around carbon dioxide removal, decarbonizing long-range shipping and trucking, decarbonizing industrial heat, avoid warming from methane emissions, and securing water supply. So there's really a wide range of opportunities that we're currently investigating for venture creation opportunities.
That's great. So once you've identified these 5 or 6 opportunities that you talked about, and we'll talk about a couple of them later on in the podcast, then the process is you go about seeking founders. You don't wait for deals to come to your table. Just tell us a little bit about that process. And also, I'm particularly keen to know what type of founders do you seek?
Yes, so there's 3 main routes by which we are trying to find the ideal founder. The first one is headhunting. Second one is via inbound applications. And the third one is via our network. And they are all splitting equally. So a third of the candidates we're usually sourcing via headhunting, a third via inbound applications, and a third via our network and via recommendations. And for headhunting, we have a proprietary software that helps us to identify technical leaders and then to reach out to them. In order to generate inbounds, we have different strategies. So for example, we are generating articles and posts that we're sharing across different networks. And then we're also organizing webinars. So this is a new component within our marketing portfolio, which seems very beneficial in order to identify and to get inbounds. And then next to these different channels that we're using to identify leaders, we also have a rigorous way of assessing candidates against our key indicators. And Adam can tell you a bit more about this.
Yeah, so what we look for in our founders is actually the same that we look for in DSV employees. So these criteria are something that Pina and myself, when we applied to DSV, were actually marked against as well. And we've been building this particular system. We've been iterating on it and testing it against real outcomes to make sure that the indicators that we're looking for actually link to real world positive results. At the highest level, this is broken down into 3 main categories: expertise, magnetism, and determination. Looking into those a little bit further, expertise breaks down into technology. So does the person have the breadth and depth of understanding of technology to address the outcome that's required? Do they have commercial understanding and expertise around the value chain and industry dynamics? And actually, one of the most important factors here is someone's ability to problem solve, which we see as a combination of first principles thinking and creativity. For magnetism, we look at persuasion, so people's ability to listen, and that people have demonstrable examples around them using the principles of influencing, that they have concise storytelling with clear language and clarity of thought surrounding that, and that they have empathy and cooperation to the members of the team that they'd be working with. Under determination, we look for 3 further indicators. One is the sense of urgency, so that someone has demonstrated incredible frustration about the current state of the solution space, and they have, whether with us or otherwise, the strong intent to work on the actual outcome that we're discussing during the selection process, that they have ambition, both for the impact that the solution could have, but also that they have a vision to look at incredibly large outcomes related to the area they're looking at. So not just looking for small solutions, but really looking for sector-changing outcomes. Their underdetermination is also resilience, where someone should show perseverance to obstacles that come in their way, show that they have the ability to learn quickly and to deal with new things that will come at them, and also to deal with uncertainty, which is clearly a large factor when building a company or dealing with in the business of creating new ventures. As you can see, there's quite a lot of indicators to consider, and it's certainly not a small part of our time or a small part of the job to find people that can achieve all these different indicators.
Well, that's a long list and quite exacting set of standards. What do you offer to these founders that makes them excited? I mean, obviously they're excited about the opportunity, otherwise they wouldn't be coming to you. But is there anything else that you offer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually the most important thing that we offer to founders is time to focus and to develop and assess the right idea. So we don't require the founders to already have an idea when they join us, but we rather support them during the ideation and conceptualization phase. And this is really appreciated by our founders. Actually, one of our founders just a couple of months ago, so when he first joined, he said, this is basically his dream coming true. He gets the time to work on a problem that he is deeply passionate about, and that he gets time to assess cutting edge technology to solve this problem while he's getting paid. So now this founder is just a month away from spinning out his company and is really content for the time he basically was allowed to dive deeper into the subject that he was deeply passionate about. But yeah, next to time, salary, and support during ideation and conceptualization, we also offer lined up funding, top quality partners, a network of other founders, and also obviously access to our purpose-built tools for ideation and recruitment.
And so my next question will be actually on both these things that you talked about, network of partners and lined up funding. Tell us a little bit about these partnerships.
Yeah, so project partners are absolutely crucial to how we run the venture creation process at DSV. We look for and work with, first and foremost, mission-aligned partners who want to collaborate with us, specifically using our methodology to develop new and impactful companies. They also have to agree and align with us on the fact that we need to have freedom to explore the breadth of potential solutions under a given outcome, so that they don't have a overall specific solution in mind when we go into the project. Once we partner with these companies, we then meet with them each on a regular cadence to discuss the projects and to challenge each other, and ultimately to support the founders in residence that come in to work on the projects. The partners also offer investment capital as well as acceleration and support for our companies, and we have the privilege to work with some really fantastic partners. So, for example, at the moment we're working with the Grantham Foundation, the Net Zero Technology Centre, Anglo-American, as well as Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. It's also worth mentioning, aside from these more formal partners, that we operate very porously with other organisations and individuals in the climate space. So even when they're not formally project partners, the contributions that other people working in the climate space are incredibly valuable. So, for example, considering the future journey of the companies we're building and also the broader landscape of where the companies will ultimately operate in and try and build in the future, this sort of porosity model is actually really important all the way through from the start of the process when we begin pre-scoping and scoping the ideas, all the way through to company formation. And even after the companies have spun out from DSV, the support we get from other organisations is really important and impactful. We do continue to spend effort in considering how these types of interactions can be even more efficient and productive for what we're trying to build.
You already talked about funders as partners, and so I assume that these funders also support your own work and the work of the founders during that process of ideation, which Pina, you talked about. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So once our companies spin out from DSV, they receive pre-seed capital from the project partners as well as from DSV and some of our closely associated ultra-high net worth individuals. For ongoing investment after the pre-seed round, our companies secure capital from the project partners that were the original sponsors of the project, all the way through to putting in capital from mission-aligned venture capital firms that we know very well. Say, for example, investors in our current climate companies after they've spun out from DSV include the likes of Lower Carbon Capital, Breakthrough Energy and Counteract. But we do continue to consider how we can bring the best capital into all of our companies.
And since both of you are on this New Ventures podcast, Pina, am I correct in assuming that you are looking at the scoping, just sort of narrowing down the carbon overall climate issue into specific things? And then, Adam, you are spending more time with helping the founders actually think through their business model, actually recruiting founders as well. What does your typical day look like?
Yeah, maybe I can start. So indeed, as head of scoping, I'm involved in two main activities within DSV, the scoping process and the recruitment of founders. But obviously, this is not something that I'm doing by myself, but we have a whole team of very talented scoping associates that are also supporting the scoping process as well as the recruitment of founders. So the scoping process in itself, as I have already mentioned before, is a key component for us during our venture creation process. And it's there to stimulate outcome and impact-driven ideation and first principles thinking. And as such, I'm helping our founders and scoping associates to apply our methodologies, to structure their ideas, and to set a balance between systematic and creative ideation and to stimulate exchange within our community. But the scoping associates, as well as our founders, are also an important part of really making the scoping process work and really getting all the information together that we need in order to set up our venture creation theses, if you so want. And on the recruitment side, I'm mostly involved in recruiting the first founder to work on an opportunity. And then later down the line, I'm supporting and training the first founder to create their co-founding team.
Adam, how do you spend your typical day?
So I sort of see my role as acting as in the typical startup sort of CEO role within the climate team. So most of my time is spent leading on the high level vision for the team and ensuring we're operating at the highest level we can through the companies we create, the partners we work with, as well as the talent we hire. I also work with Pina and also Noah, who heads up the BD and portfolio elements of the team, by playing ultimately a supporting and enabling role. For example, in scoping, I have a Ph.D. in chemistry myself, and so I do try, if possible, to contribute to any technical discussions or considerations here, as well as supporting the wider work in business development, scoping, hiring and portfolio work. Beyond these activities, I work on other critical components, such as considering team growth. We're growing quickly at the moment. Also working on core team hiring and financing and funding mechanisms for the companies we're building.
Listening to you, I'm just struck by how different your approach is from other accelerators or other investors. Obviously, you are very actively participating in this whole process. And funnily enough, I'm reminded actually of many years back when I was in university. I was absolutely passionate about doing theater. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine who is to be a director, actually. He was a very good actor. So in some ways, I'm thinking about both of you as actually directors of plays because, you are good actors. Obviously, you have both degrees in science and you've experience, but you're not sort of there on the stage yourself. You have set the stage up. You've got the lighting up. You've got the partnerships to sell the play. In this particular case, my friend used to always make sure that we got a chance to stage the play. He always had these plays lined up. And then he's looking for actors all the time to come in and act in his plays. That's what I'm really taking away from the work you do, which is obviously fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've understood your approach. Let's talk about your approach in action. Obviously, Pina, you've talked about 5 or 6 areas, but 2 particular ones I wanted to get deeper into this conversation is this topic of direct air capture, because obviously it's so important. And the other one is the topic you talked about right in the beginning, which is the supply chain in renewable energy. Let's talk about direct air capture first. Just give us an overview of what the companies you are supporting are doing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So as an organization, we've spent a lot of time thinking about carbon dioxide removal and direct air capture technologies and business models. As Pina's outlined, we're very much outcome focused, working to consider constraints and solutions And even in the CDR space, especially on the gigaton scale, we don't see there's going to be a silver bullet given the opportunity landscape that's present there. So the companies that we've built so far in this space are focused on different markets and constraint sets. So, for example, geospatial considerations, the ultimate CO2 destination, material availability, the overall scale that the technology should be deployed at, as well as the deployability of each unit at the scale of the business model. So we build ultimately a number of companies to be complementary across these spaces, but they also are built to be individually successful in the area they're playing in. So, for example, taking Parallel Carbon, they've been built to be very supply chain focused. It's been optimized to be very useful with intermittent energy production. They've leveraging free air movement to capture the CO2, using electrochemical release step, and ultimately also creating hydrogen on the side, which they can sell into the market. So they're building a geomimetic carbon capture company, which is paired with electrochemical processing, and their process only uses wind and sunshine and abundant minerals to build incredibly large scale direct air capture facilities. Mission Zero, which is another company we built in the space, on the other hand, has been built around the constraints of off-the-shelf engineering components for easy development and scalability. They have worked around biomimetic energy efficient systems with electrochemical release step, and they also have been optimizing for easy economical deployment at the industrial scale, especially for the CO2 commodity market. So ultimately, Mission Zero are building a bio-inspired carbon capture company which operates at ambient conditions and can be used in the commodity market. A third company we've built in the space is Holy Grail. Holy Grail really was optimizing for working from all the way down at the gram scale, all the way up to the megaton scale, using advanced membrane materials. And so their overall technology has fewer moving engineering components, parts and maintenance, and that differentiates them from Parallel Carbon and Mission Zero. We're also looking right now, whilst working with the Grantham Foundation, on additional approaches that focus on even more different opportunity sets and constraints. I think Pina can talk about that briefly.
Yeah, right. So in our latest work on carbon dioxide removal, we are very much focused on the goal to optimize for both CO2 capture and storage while leveraging all available paths that we have. So biological means, geochemical means, and also engineering solutions. And we will now soon be spinning out a company focusing on CO2 capture and storage in closed pit lakes, a direct air capture solution that is optimized for scalable waste heat integration, and a biomass conversion process targeting wet biomass that cannot be used for energy or other material purposes.
And I think I will at least have to ask you a few follow-up questions just to make sure that I understand some of the terms you're using. Obviously, you used the word membrane solution, and I think I get that. Membranes allow the diffusion of carbon dioxide from one side of the membrane to another for capture. The word that I did not understand in the context of direct air capture is electrochemical. Could you just demystify these two technologies a little bit?
All right. So in very simple terms, within electrochemistry, you basically have two components. You have the electrodes and an electrolyte. And in electrochemistry, you're working across the interface of the electrodes and your electrolyte. And you do have electrons that can accumulate in the electrodes, and you do have ions in the electrolyte. And it's basically the communication between the electrons and the ions that you are targeting within electrochemical approaches. So in the case of direct air capture, you can, for example, use a current that is going into the electrodes, and that is then driving redox reactions at the interface of the electrodes to then change the pH in the solution where the carbon dioxide would be dissolved. And therefore, you can change the solubility of the carbon dioxide in solution.
That's very interesting. So basically, an electricity is being generated, which is sort of putting together electrolysis process. That electricity, and Adam, I'm just remembering what you said about parallel carbon, can be generated by renewable energy, which is why some direct air carbon capture technologies require the ability to use intermittent sources. But in any case, to this electrolysis process, for when you say redox, our audience should know that it's reduction and oxidation. So that means the amount of carbon dioxide that can be absorbed by the electrolyte medium, which is a liquid medium, increases, and therefore that's the way carbon dioxide is captured.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that. So you have basically two steps within direct air capture that you need to work with. On the one hand side, you do have the contacting step where you are capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. And then in the second step, you need to be able to release that again. And you can, for example, capture CO2 on a solid sorbent or in a liquid sorbent. And in an electrochemical approach, you usually have a liquid sorbent. So then imagine you have the CO2 in an alkaline solution. And then the question is, how do you release the CO2 from the solution? And there's different means. Either you could heat up the solution, that would be a thermal approach, or you can change the pH of the solution, which would also release the CO2. So it's really about identifying the ways by which you can change the solubility of the CO2 in your sorbent. And one way to use electrochemical solutions would be to change the pH of your solution and therefore decrease the pH and therefore release the CO2 from the solution, therefore regenerate your sorbent so that you can use it again to capture more CO2. So that would be like a very simple approach. Obviously, there is alterations to that.
It's also worth pointing out that a lot of the earlier direct air capture and CDR approaches did use thermal, so heating the sorbent to release the CO2. That can be quite challenging to decarbonize relative to the electrochemical processes, which is why our companies have used various forms of electrochemistry to do the release step in their processes.
Right. And our audience should remember that when Pina is talking about pH, she means acidity. She's talking about pH being reduced. She means acidity to be increased. So as acidity of the liquid electrolyte is increased, becomes more acidic, carbon dioxide is released. So that means the electrolyte solution can be reused. One word that I wanted to make sure I understand clearly is this word industrial scale. And in general, the word scale, because, you talked a little bit about Holy Grail sort of catering to a large range of scales. What scales of carbon capture are we talking about here?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think it comes down to two different things. One is the ultimate ambition of the amount of CO2 that needs to be captured. So it's very well known that we're talking about, in even best case scenarios, we're going to have to capture gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere, and that's billions of tons of CO2. So when we're talking about scale, we're talking about, are you ultimately targeting putting these things down at absolutely incredible scale with a primary outcome to remove as much as possible? Or, and when I've used the term industrial scale, what I'm really talking about there is when CO2 is actually going to be used directly in industry itself. And so the primary outcome, although you are removing CO2, is about fitting any technology that will remove CO2 within an industrial process. And therefore, you're probably talking about much smaller scales. I say small, it's still thousands of tons of CO2, but it's not as big, it's orders of magnitude smaller than the gigatons that are actually going to be have to be removed going forwards.
Right. And finally, one more thing that I want to understand a little bit more. Pina, when you talked about companies that you're looking at, you talked about companies that are mimicking biological processes, direct air capture. Now, once you use the word biological, I'm thinking trees and forests, right? Is that what you're getting to?
Yes, when we're talking about biology, it is about tapping onto the possibility to capture and store CO2 via photosynthesis. So obviously trees and plants and also some microorganisms are already capturing CO2 or taking up CO2 in the context of photosynthesis. And now we are basically looking on the one hand side how we can increase the uptake of CO2 via photosynthesis, but also how we can make biomass a more durable CO2 sink, or how we can increase the permanence of biomass to not release the CO2 again into the atmosphere. So today, the photosynthetic activity is already drawing down hundreds of gigatons of CO2 just due to the forests and plants that we are having. But at the same time, the majority of CO2 gets released again because the CO2 is not turned into permanent biomaterials, let's say. For example, just due to the bio-waste that we're generating, we're again releasing gigatons of CO2. And we're now focusing in this context. So basically, there is these two paths that you can take. Either we can try to increase the CO2 uptake in our biomass, for example, by reforestation or by even re-engineering biomass to increase the CO2 that they can take up within the photosynthetic process. But these processes in itself are either vulnerable or, especially when you're talking about genetic engineering, they can take very long time until you get to a successful result and until you can really deploy it at large scale. So in this context, we think the much easier solution is to actually avoid the decay of biomass and to just convert the biomass that would ultimately lead to new CO2 emissions into more durable components. So there's, for example, approaches that use pyrolysis or other processes to convert biomass waste into biochar. But there's still a big component of the carbon that was previously stored, but that was previously captured in the biomass that is re-released via CO2 or in the form of CO2 emissions. And now within this context, we are basically looking at, or in what form you can best convert all of the biomass waste and then also store it permanently. So it's kind of comparing the efficiency of the biomass conversion processes against the available storage environment that we have access to at the moment. So this is something that we looked into with one of our founders, and where we now have a hypothesis as to which process might be most efficient in actually converting the biomass into a storable form of carbon that can be stored for thousands of years.
I suppose my audience will already know the meaning of the word pyrolysis, but just in case you don't, when Pina uses the word pyrolysis, she means heating of organic matter in the absence of oxygen.
Right.
Let's just go back to what we were talking about at the beginning about, getting the founders in. If you can give us in the examples of these companies that you talked about, just a story, maybe how you got the founder, how you helped him or her build the company, how you helped him or her raise the next round of funding. That type of stories is always very useful.
Yes, absolutely. I can give some examples of how some of the teams came together, which I think exemplifies the different types of recruitment mechanisms that we use, that Pina mentioned earlier. So starting with Parallel Carbon, Ryan, who's the CEO, was an expert in-house at Bloomberg on carbon capture, utilization and storage. Don, who's one of DSV's co-founders, reached out to Ryan to discuss direct air capture insurance. And through that interaction and the conversation he had with Don, he actually just came to work at DSV as a founder in residence to explore negative emissions technologies. And over that time, he focused on the previously discussed constraints around supply chain and renewable energy deployability. When he was looking for his co-founder, there was someone already working at DSV actually called Aranza, who is now the Parallel Carbon co-founder. He was working on a different concept and had originally come to DSV through word of mouth from another candidate, which he'd actually found through headhunting. But at the time she was exploring her concept, she got talking to Ryan about what he was doing or thinking of doing in Parallel Carbon, and she really liked the approach that he was working on. At that time, Ryan was also looking for a co-founder with electrochemical experience, and Aranza actually had a Ph.D. in electrochemistry from the University of Manchester. So actually combining those two people as a co-founder team in Parallel Carbon made a lot of sense. And now they are a team subsequently secured support and finance from a VC firm called Counteract, who we know very well, and they're now in the process of raising another round of finance for their technology.
I mean, this is obviously a powerful example of networking and creating the network effect. This is fascinating, Adam. Any other story you have?
Yeah, so for example, with Mission Zero, Gayal, who came in as founder in residence on a project where we were looking at carbon neutral fuels, and he actually spun out two companies. One was Mission Zero and one was a company called Supercritical Solutions. The reason why he came up with these concepts was because in order to enable carbon neutral fuels to exist, you need to have a very efficient direct air capture process, which is Mission Zero, high pressure, cheap green hydrogen, which is something that Supercritical are working on. We were supporting Gael through this project, and as it came together, he was looking to move into the CSO position himself, and he was looking for a CEO and also a chief product officer to join him. Nick, who is now the CEO of Mission Zero, was actually referred by another one of our portfolio companies as someone who would be really great for this role. And Shil, who was the chief product officer, applied for the job on LinkedIn. So that three-person founding team came together using a variety of the different methods that we use in Deep Science Ventures. Since they came together, they spun out and they've been invested in by Anglo American, which is one of our partners, went through the Net Zero Technology Centre Accelerator Programme, and they received several £1 million since from the UK government and less than 24 months from incorporation. So when the company was formed, they closed a $5 million seed round with Breakthrough Energy and Anglo American as well. I think that's another good example of how teams can come together. I also have another example, which is for a newer company that we've just created called Dunia Innovations. This is not a direct air capture company, but they are focusing on the creation of new catalysts for CO2 to X processes, so where CO2 is converted into some other fuel or chemical. The founder in residence that came in on that project was a guy called Ahmed, and we recruited him actually via using our internal software, which we use to find and headhunt people. We knew we were looking for catalyst expertise. This project actually followed on from the work that Gael was doing, and we knew that type of expertise was going to be key to unlocking some of the other outcomes we really cared about. After we found Ahmed, and he was someone that passed all of the right founder characteristics that we discussed earlier, but also had worked in the catalyst and material science space for over 10 years. So he was an ideal candidate for this particular area, an outcome we were trying to solve for. In the process of looking for the co-founders, I actually found them when I was networking at a Net Zero Technology Centre event, and I came across two people called Marcus and Alex who had actually been working in the field of inorganic material design using machine learning and automation, which was exactly the technology stack we were trying to build into Dunia. Obviously, after the normal interview processes and making sure we were rigorous there, they joined Dunia and joined Ahmed in creating Dunia as CEO and CTO. And now they're in Berlin building their systems. They secured a normal pre-seed round, which we offer the companies we build. During the investor discovery phase of our process, where we try to get external opinions from investors on what we're trying to build, they actually got one investor excited about what they were doing, and they secured additional capital to allow them to build even faster than they would have done, which was a fantastic result. So as you can see across those different examples of companies, those three different mechanisms that Pina discussed earlier have all been leveraged to find the right co-founding teams.
That's very fascinating. And, the mechanisms coming to life. I mean, supercritical solutions is particularly interesting. I know we're not going to talk about it in our podcast today. It is using hydrogen, if I remember correctly, in also a distillery project in a UK government funded green distillery project. Just so you know, I mean, climate technology and whiskey are my favorite topics of discussion.
They're the perfect company for you then, Sanjoy. But yeah, fundamentally Supercritical are doing a really interesting job in creating, the fundamental insight that led to us building Supercritical was that the hydrogen that's going to be utilised, we think, most is likely to be in the chemicals industry. And so it's always going to be at a significantly high pressure. So working back from that particular constraint, saying, we don't only need to create cheap hydrogen, but we need to create cheap hydrogen that's at pressure, and not thinking about the pressurization aspect of the technology as an afterthought where you just used a train of compressors to get it up to the right pressure. That ultimately led to the design of Supercritical. So yeah, it's a really interesting case study, I think, of starting with the end outcome and then working backwards to figure out what the technology really needs to do and to be in order to be successful in a space.
Lovely. And Pina, let me go back to you. you said the availability of raw materials, metals and precious earths actually, for the renewable energy transition is one of your focus areas. This is a big problem. And I know you have got companies looking at it, but maybe for our audience, just help us understand the big problem that that we can be all facing.
Yeah, right. So I already explained in the beginning of our conversation how the deployment of renewable energy is linked to the availability of critical minerals, such as lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and copper. And there's also very comprehensive reports, for example, from the IEA published on this topic. And there's also a super nice short article from CTVC on the startup landscape in this space. But just to kind of give you a bit of a glimpse at the problem that we're dealing with. So in essence, the energy transition is a transition away from fossil fuels towards critical minerals. And until the mid-2010s, for most minerals, the energy sector represented only a small part of the demand. However, in a scenario where we want to meet the Paris Agreement goals, the share of total demand rises significantly. So, for example, copper and earth, here the share of total demand would rise up to 40%. But if we're looking at lithium, here the share of total demand coming from the energy sector would rise up to 90%. And this in itself, of course, also means a significant multiple increase for the demand in general for the individual minerals. So lithium here, the demand would increase by 42x if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. Nickel would increase by 19x. Rare earth elements would increase by 7x. So it's really significant demand increases that we would need to supply. And so we would need to be able to meet the demand with the supply while battling against reducing ore qualities, increasing environmental impact, a very long mining lead times, and as well as political and trade constraints. So just to give you a couple of examples, the majority of surplus and deficit scenarios for lithium predict a shortage of lithium in the coming decades. So this, of course, doesn't mean that there is not enough lithium around, but it's more talking about the amount of lithium that we can extract economically. Then another example, ore quality of copper is continuously decreasing, and the same for nickel. So the average copper ore grade in Chile declined by 30% over the past 15 years. Nickel dropped from 3% in the 60s to 1% today. And this comes on top of very long lead times to open up new mines, always being multiple years. So for example, lithium here, the average lead time to really start extracting and tapping onto new lithium sources would be 5 years. However, when we're talking about nickel and copper, the lead time is on average 16 years. And this also is, and just on the geographical side, the constraints are that over 50% of extraction or refining of critical minerals are linked to a single country. So, for example, in cobalt, it would be the Democratic Republic of Congo. For rare earth elements, this would be China, which is, of course, leading or has the potential for trade constraints. And then also on the environmental side, around 50% of copper and lithium are extracted under extremely high water stress levels. So you can see that there's really a multitude of constraints around on different levels and crossing different disciplines that we need to solve in order to really make sure that we can respond to the demand increase of these minerals in order to make sure that we're not slowing down our energy transition. And here we do think there's basically 3 different ways of tackling this. So on the one hand side, we need to find ways as to how we can secure the increase of extraction of new materials, so that would be the primary target. But then at the same time, we also need to increase recycling and reuse rates in order to reduce some of the pressure on the extraction of new virgin materials. And then at the same time, or next to these 2 options, you would have the third option, which would be about reducing the elements that are specifically risky in the context of a certain application. So for example, reducing the dependency of rare earth elements for the production of permanent magnets. Now, amongst these sub-outcomes, we are currently focusing on the first one. So how we can support activities to really increase the extraction of new mineral sources. And here there are two constraints that we are mostly focusing on. So how we can accelerate the lead times and increase the success of new mining operations, and the second one being how we can increase the possibility to extract minerals from ores that are currently considered below grade or waste. And for the first one here, we have one company in our portfolio that is looking into that, Optic Earth. They're using a machine learning workflow to assess geophysical data. And now we're also currently looking into specific venture opportunities in this second category that I was describing. So how we can extract minerals from currently considered below grade ores or waste. And here, just to give you some indications. So if you're looking at lithium contained in brines and seawater alone would reach nearly 2 million tons and therefore would represent a potentially inexhaustible supply of lithium if we can extract it from brines and seawater. Another example, copper mining sites have over a decade worth of minerals trapped in waste, which is equivalent to about $2 trillion. So there's really a lot to be gained if we're able to tap on ores or waste materials that are currently considered below grade ores. And there's also already a couple of activities going in that direction, especially in the context of lithium. So you, for example, have Vulcan Energy, Mangrove Lithium or Lilac Solutions. They're looking at lithium extraction from brines. And there's also one company called Mines that are looking at nickel extraction from soil. But at the same time, we still need to look into how we can reduce the cost of these methods, of these technologies, how we can increase the efficiency and the productivity of these processes, and how can we reduce the CO2 emissions associated with. And then, of course, also how can we expand the technologies that are now, for example, looked at for lithium or for nickel also to other elements. So there's really some interesting technological questions as well that still need to be solved in order to make these technologies worthwhile. Now, all the things that I have now mentioned in the context of the problem analysis around critical minerals and the opportunity analysis for us to get involved. This is all work based on one of our scoping associates. It's called Eric, and he has done an amazing job in analyzing basically the problems and the opportunities associated with that.
This is fascinating, and we've come to the end of the podcast. Pina and Adam, obviously there's been so much discussed, but what I'm really taking away is that, Pina, I'll start with you because I really like the way you think. A big problem, break it up into components, then break it up into outcomes, and then invest for those outcomes. And then, Adam, I really like the way you said, invest in complementary technologies, but invest in each company becoming profitable in its own right. And what I found most fascinating, apart from, of course, the discussion on supercritical solutions, is the story that you provided on how founders came together, how your different mechanisms of hiring founders sort of coalesced, almost as it were, in helping cross-fertilize ideas, people talking to each other and developing new ideas, which helped spun off companies and help build solutions that can be the savior of mankind. Pina and Adam, do you have questions for me?
How did you come across Deep Science Ventures? Why did you want to talk to us?
As I said in the beginning, I've been looking at the early stage climate innovation ecosystem. To me, this is an important problem because we all know that entrepreneurial and innovative ventures have a very high failure rate. However, we also know that entrepreneurial and innovative ventures have to succeed, give ourselves a chance. To me, the question about how do you increase the success rate at a systemic level is very, very key. I think what to me is fascinating is that various approaches are being applied in the United Kingdom. So we have Carbon 13, which is bringing together entrepreneurs, people who not necessarily have an idea, but to come together, build a project. So taking away the risk of teams. We have the Greenhouse, which is out of Imperial College. They've changed their name to Undaunted, to where they're supporting companies to get to seed investment. And you are just putting in place a completely different idea, which to me is like setting up a stage so that talented people can come and succeed in what they want to do.
It's interesting to hear your perspective. I think if I ever try and summarize DSV's model very simply, it's really about trying to deal with the two biggest failure rates in startup companies. One is having the correct team in place, which in some cases happens serendipitously, and we obviously try and do that in a very managed way, to put the right combination of expertise and personalities in the team to sort of remove that failure mode. And then the other side is companies that are looking to push technologies that they've developed into markets that maybe aren't the ideal markets for those technologies, or there are other potential solutions which could win out when you consider the ultimate outcome you're trying to build for. And so again, starting with that outcome and then figuring out which technologies that exist in the available scientific knowledge base could be combined to actually solve those problems alongside a team that's built for purpose. As you said very well, it's trying to make these companies more successful and reduce the chance of failing, achieving the mission they're aiming for. So it's interesting to hear your view on that.
Exactly. If people want to connect with you, is there any way that you would recommend?
Yeah, if people want to reach out to discuss anything we've talked about or anything else relating to company building in the climate space, please just connect on LinkedIn and we can start a conversation there.
With that, thank you very much, Adam and Pina.
Thank you, Sanjoy.
Thank you for having us, Sanjoy.
If you like this podcast, do visit us on regainparadise.org, regainparadise.com. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can also subscribe to these podcasts on Anchor, Spotify, Google, Apple, and YouTube.